if we say that there is purpose in COVID, whether we recognize it or not, if we say it even exists, that there's purpose in it. If people don't want to recognize, if they want to remain in egocentric points of view and not recognize their oneness, they have the free will right to do so. And that said, our narcissistic approach as a species has been to devour each other and to devour the world and just to destroy it and to destroy each other wantonly and not to recognize our oneness. So how could you develop a mechanism by which to help people recognize the oneness of all societies and in a way, the equality? One way would be to release a virus into the world, and then people's taproot dynamics and ego dynamics and tribal dynamics would be required for survival purposes to be suspended and to allow some space of learning to occur, so that people who were narcissistic and egocentric, or people who were fearful and stuck in positionalities of ego, and people who were caring about the collective and also themselves, would have something to talk about and learn from together. Are we making sense with that so far? Something that they could all talk about and feel themselves affected by. Not that they'd agree to the dynamics of or the importance of, still that they recognize, whether they believe in it or not, they recognize that it's a part of their life. So even the conspiracy theorists that would say there is no COVID and they're creating vaccines to inject implanted DNA change into the whole population, and it's all a hideous plot, at least they're talking about a different dimension of the same thing. So if we look at COVID as the elephant, and some people are holding on to the elephant's leg, and the blind person, men and women, holding on to the elephant's leg and saying, oh, the elephant of COVID is a tree. And others holding on to the tail of the elephant of COVID and say, no, it's a rope. And others touching the side of it and say, no, it's a wall, or its trunk and say, no, it's a snake. Must there be some way to work together eventually on the same topic and share different points of view about it to work towards a collective understanding of anything? So the people that start at the trunk are not going to agree with the people who start at the tail, and they're not going to agree with the people that start with the legs of the elephant. And is this a conversation that is being required for us to be engaged in, and a learning process that we're being required to be engaged in across time and across all races, nations, peoples, cultures, religions, genders, and age groups? So from that vantage point, could we say that there's a lot of bridges? We may not see them. We may not want to see them. We may want to see, if you imagine this is a rope bridge with a lot of wooden boards that people could walk along to cross the bridge, they may want to just look at their board on the bridge and say, no, there is no bridge. There's only this board. That said, they're standing side by side with somebody else and say, no, there's only my board of the bridge and there's no bridge. Or there's others saying, oh, there's a whole bridge and you're not seeing other than one or two boards in the whole bridge. So if we create a broader discussion that is integrative rather than separatist or divisive or fear-driven or positionality-driven in its dynamic, can we do that for any topic? COVID, climate change, etc. Gender inequality, racial inequality, prejudice, bias, terrorism, war. It's this learning dynamic of humanity that is position-based. And the positionality is generally driven by either fear or ego or personal values or conditioned in values or culture or simulacra or fragmentations of subconscious being triggered by different dynamics. It's our hope in the WSS that we are developing a collective learning process, meaning that anybody and everybody in each of the team of teams can learn and arrive at not the same point of view, at a shared collective point of view, and be able to say, yeah, we know what an elephant is. We know what it looks like when it defecates. We know what it looks like when it plays in the rivers and washes itself. We know what it looks like when it's running around. We know what it sounds like. We understand the elephant in its totality. Human learning processes we've discussed before are tribal based and are fragmented. So the Roman aqueducts that we lined with lead and poisoned our children and our populations with in the past, we didn't learn that lesson collectively enough. Therefore, we now poison our own water tables and damage the world and create global warming. So this collective learning process is vitally important if we want to survive as a species and if we want to become good, devoted stewards to the natural world, and if we want to generate a life process for humanity that works. So we would suggest that if you can create a larger conversation that people can see the linkages of, then it doesn't mean they're going to agree. We don't suggest arguing with them and say, oh, no, you're wrong. We don't suggest, and we're not saying you would do that. We're not trying to disprove what their positionality is. We suggest putting the pieces of all the puzzles of all the positionalities together at the same time so that they become a gestalt whole that becomes discussable in a more democratic way rather than an argumentative way. Evolution of understanding, learning, consciousness through experience, individually and collectively, is a necessary process. It is unfolding at the speed and timing and cadence and dynamics that it is. And if we gain the capacity to facilitate it and support it, to catalyze it, then we can get to unity much faster with less bumps in the road, less conflicts, and with less misunderstanding or challenges. There's the dynamic of duality, the root chakra tendency to divide the world up into polarized vantage points of right, wrong, good, bad, true, false, safe, unsafe, acceptable, unacceptable. Those dualistic interpretations are just a practice field for organizing ever more sophisticated and nuanced interpretations of life experience that eventually result in consciousness. So duality is not wrong or bad. It's a set of training wheels that we start with and evolve upward through and out of eventually. And duality is expressed often in prejudice and bias and extremes of vantage point or valuation of one thing over another, or one positionality over another, one political vantage point over another, one desire or motivation over another, and invalidation of other values, positionalities, beliefs, or ways of life. That dynamic is a dynamic of evolution of consciousness ultimately, and it operates at a very glacial pace. We don't have time to learn that way anymore as a species. So the world is being pressurized by COVID and by climate change and by diminishing resources. And that you could look at that pressurization as taking all of these billions or trillions of soap bubbles of positionalities and compressing them in together so they are required to fuse and integrate into a larger shared collective consciousness that is more heterogeneous, less dualistic, less polarized, less divided, more united, more integrated, more synthesized, more sophisticated, and thus more potentially utilizable as a decision-making approach to how we develop as a species in the future. If we don't do that, if we don't, instead of dividing ourselves into an infinite number of polarized fragments driven by fear and taproot dynamics and desire and judgmentalness and victim perpetrator rescuer dynamics, if we don't choose to give that up and choose to find a way intentionally to be constantly motivated to unite, to balance, to harmonize, to integrate, to synthesize, to forgive, to heal, and to value each other and love each other, then we're unlikely to be able to align and be mobilized to work together in a way that will allow us to generate a life process that everyone can kind of be okay with, less haves versus have-nots, less inequality, and more wisdom in our solutions generation process and adaptive technology development process, and in our management of our social process and cultural processes. So that goes, of course, with religions. Religions are often polarized, either against each other or against everybody that's not our religion, so to speak. We wouldn't suggest any religion's better than any other, and they do compete. They compete for followership, or they compete for resources, or they compete for survival, or they compete for retaining their purity and their values and their dogma or beliefs. So without this pressurization process, where would we find the motivation to transcend this divisiveness that has been so endemic in our species historically?